In the time it takes to watch this video, many species will move one step closer to extinction. One region in particular, Europe, has seen more extinctions than almost any region on Earth. In fact, out of Europe's animals, 3,000 are threatened with extinction. However, in this video, we aren't looking to the future, but to the past. We'll be taking a look at all of Europe's extinct animals and what caused them to disappear, including one species you'd never expect once lived in Europe. Before we dive into the animals lost over the last few centuries, let's first look at what happened after the last ice age ended. As the ice age retreated, a new force began reshaping Europe: humans. As expected, it is islands that experienced the greatest number of extinctions. Lying off the coast of Spain in the Mediterranean sits an archipelago known as the Balearic Islands. Although they are still home to some endemic species, in historic times, these islands hosted a much richer collection of animals. One of the most unique of these was Myotragus, a goat-like herbivore that inhabited the islands. In addition to having a long lifespan of up to 27 years, these animals featured a number of odd traits, such as their forward-facing eyes, uncommon for ungulates. Its evolutionary history remains puzzling, but it's believed its closest relative is the Tarkin from the mountains of China. But based on their morphologies, it is clear that they split from each other a very long time ago. Myotragus is believed to have arrived after the Mediterranean Sea dried up millions of years ago. Finding an ecosystem that lacked grazing herbivores, they soon filled that ecological niche. Alongside them lived giant dormice, which also adapted to the island's isolation by developing a much bigger size than those on the mainland, as well as an extended lifespan of up to 10 years. Other native land mammals included the shrew Nesotites, which like the dormice, grew much larger than their mainland cousins. But after the arrival of humans in the 3rd millennium BC, all 3 species disappeared. Unlike other islands, where introduced predators and human hunting are often blamed for extinctions, in this case the reason remains less certain. The prevailing hypothesis suggests that non-native rodents introduced by humans spread disease, rapidly wiping out all the native mammals who had no immunity to it. But what about the native birds? When water rails found themselves on an island without predators, they slowly began to develop traits similar to other flightless rails around the world, becoming the Ibiza rail. By the time humans arrived, it had lost most of its defenses, and as wetlands only covered a small percentage of their island, their population was small, and so they were quickly hunted to extinction. The same story as many other flightless birds, like dodos. As for reptiles, all the endemic species survived, but a subspecies of the snub-nosed adder wasn't so lucky, becoming extinct around the same time. Island species had declined greatly, but so have large mainland animals. During the Ice Age, a giant deer known as the Irish elk, which was the largest deer to ever roam the earth, spanned all the way from Ireland to Siberia. Its enormous antlers, stretching up to 4.4 meters across, were unmatched by any other known deer. Despite its name, the Irish elk was not closely related to the animals we call elk today. Instead, its closest living relative is the fallow deer. Its remains have been unearthed for centuries, with discoveries dating as far back as 1695. Early humans are known to have hunted them, but ancient drawings suggest that they were not as common as smaller species of deer. It's speculated that their massive antlers made it difficult for them to run through dense forests, meaning that they couldn't escape humans. This, combined with the reduced forest density, proved to be too much for the Irish elk. Whatever the cause, their range shrank fast, with the latest remains found in Russia. Over in the Mediterranean, the Greek islands, particularly Crete, have experienced a great loss of species. The Cretan owl, dwarf hippo, and otter were already extinct by the time humans arrived, yet the mouse Mus minotaurus managed to survive. This mouse had actually killed off the giant rats that called the island home, by either outcompeting them or giving them disease. And whilst rodents increased in size, the Cretan dwarf elephant had evolved to become 40% smaller than its mainland ancestor, shrinking to the size of an Asian elephant. An entire genus of deer also evolved on the islands. All of these animals disappeared as a result of both humans hunting them and destroying their habitat. Fossils of dwarf elephants have also been found on other Mediterranean islands, but the lack of fossils means we cannot know for sure if they existed at the same time as people. However, it's likely that they overlapped with humans on at least some of the islands. During the Ice Age, a huge grassland ecosystem known as the steppe extended across Europe and Asia. This ecosystem was known for having tons of huge mammals, one of which was the steppe bison. The steppe bison was slightly bigger than any other kind of bison, weighing almost a ton. As the Ice Age came to a close, the steppe began to shrink, and so did the populations of the animals that relied on it. By 10,000 years ago, the warming at the end of the Ice Age had mostly halted, and human activity became the driving force behind their extinction. Neither human hunting or climate change alone caused their extinction, but together they ultimately caused its decline. The most recent steppe bison remains date back to 1060 BC from Leningrad, Russia. Along with the bison, the collapse of the steppe ecosystem also led to the extinction of the steppe pika in Europe, but fortunately, they still survive in Asia. Moving yet again to a Mediterranean island, Sardinia's fossil record provides evidence for the existence of 4 endemic species that all became extinct at the same time. Among these fossils were the remains of the Sardinian pika. The high abundance of their fossils shows that they must have been very common on the island. The Sardinian pika was the last member of a group known as Prolagus, which had been extinct on the mainland for a very long time. Cats and dogs ate the pikas, whilst rodents and hares competed for their food. Like the pikas, many other small mammals found themselves vulnerable to the changes brought about by human settlers, including the rodent Ragamis, the endemic vole Microtus henselli, the Acericola shrew, and the Tyrrhenian mole. However, this wasn't the first wave of extinctions on Sardinia. An earlier event caused the extinctions of the Sardinian dhole, the dwarf mammoth, 3 species of otter, including the Sardinian giant otter, which stretched to over 2 meters in length, and the last member of a group of deer known as Premegacerus. These larger animals were hunted by humans, as they made for more valuable targets, as well as being easier to spot and having smaller populations, whilst the smaller mammals survived the initial arrival of humans. Today, the grey whale is only found in the northern Pacific, but it once reached into the Atlantic Ocean. DNA has revealed that a significant migration event took place about 5,000 years ago, when lower levels of Arctic sea ice allowed grey whales to cross into the Atlantic. Upon arrival, they established populations along the coast of Europe. Unfortunately, whaling decimated the Atlantic population, and they were eventually completely wiped out of the Atlantic Ocean. There is hope, however, that the species could recolonize the Atlantic as a result of the warming climate, which is making the Arctic Ocean more hospitable for migration. And indeed, individual grey whales have already been spotted as far as Namibia and Israel, though no permanent populations have been established so far. After the extinction of the cold-adapted cave lion, modern lions migrated into Europe through Anatolia and established a population. These lions eventually managed to extend as far north as Ukraine and Hungary, where they survived well into the Neolithic period, establishing themselves as a keystone apex predator in Southeast Europe's ecosystem. Large-scale hunting and captures had reduced their populations over time, and by the 4th century BC, lions could no longer be found in Greece, their final stronghold. There is no doubt that the northern bald ibis is a strange-looking bird, with the fossil record telling us that it once roamed widely across the Mediterranean, being found as far north as the Swiss Alps. Nowadays, the species is restricted to cliff edges and arid regions, but during the 17th century, it was a familiar sight along Europe's major rivers, and even nested on castle battlements, where they were able to eke out a living hunting beetles and lizards. But they suddenly vanished from Europe in the 17th century. Across the northern bald ibis's range, its population plummeted over 98% during the 20th century, putting the bird on the brink of extinction. Fortunately for the northern bald ibis, a breeding program saved them from extinction, being upgraded from critically endangered to just endangered. While hunting was a major factor in its recent decline, the disappearance of the species from Europe remains a bit of a mystery. Given the sudden nature of the collapse, some scientists suspect that a disease wiped them out from Europe, but was unable to spread in the warmer and drier regions. Cattle are one of the most numerous animals on the planet, but few people can tell you the animal which they were domesticated from. The reason for that is because their ancestor is now extinct, the auroch, a bovine species that spanned from the Korean peninsula to Great Britain. At their peak, these animals thrived in the dense riparian forest and wetlands that covered much of Europe. Their decline began during the Holocene epoch, with the Indian species disappearing after the rise of the Indus Valley civilization, and with the African subspecies disappearing with the Roman Empire's conquest of the Nile Delta. In Europe, widespread hunting had made them rarer and rarer, and by the Middle Ages, only nobles were allowed to hunt them. This hunting was unfortunately still enough to drive them to extinction, with the last recorded sighting being made in 1627, although remains prove the species survived in Bulgaria into the 1700s. The extinction of the great auk is one of the most well-known extinction events in history, often compared to that of the dodo. This flightless bird was basically the North Pole's version of penguins. Their colonies once lined the North Atlantic's coast, numbering in the millions. Its flightlessness is unusual when considering it shared its habitat with predators like the polar bear, which were known to raid their nesting sites. For over 100,000 years, they had been hunted by Neanderthals and later Homo sapiens, but their demise started with the age of exploration, when rats brought by ships invaded their nesting sites, decimating countless colonies. The onset of the Little Ice Age didn't help either, as expanding sea ice allowed polar bears to reach previously inaccessible islands. The last grey auk in Britain was killed in 1840 by two men who believed it was a witch that caused a storm, and the final colony clung onto Iceland's Great Oak Rock, an inaccessible rocky outcrop that protected them from humans and invasive species. Unfortunately, all the odds were stacked against them, with a volcanic eruption submerging the rock, causing them to flee to the nearby island of Eldey. This island, however, was accessible to people, and the last pair was killed, with even their eggs being smashed by hunters. The Rattus Island lizard inhabited a tiny rocky outcrop in the Bay of Mahon. Although only a subspecies, its story is too interesting to not include. This species was unique in just how small its range was, a fact that made them vulnerable to people. As the population of the bay grew, more and more boats travelled through, and in 1950, Rattus Island was blew up to make it easier for boats to navigate, completely obliterating the lizard's only home. One animal definitely not associated with Europe are tigers, but the Caspian tiger lived as far as the Caucasus Mountains, though its range only just extended into Russia, and it never established permanent populations any further in Europe. Stray tigers were reported as far as northern Ukraine. The decline of the Caspian tiger began in the Middle Ages, and by the 20th century, its numbers had dwindled rapidly. The last known Caspian tigers went extinct in the 1990s in Afghanistan. Though it only just skirted the edge of Europe, it shows just how much the ranges of large predators have been reduced as a result of human activity. The threat of extinction isn't just something of the past. In fact, more species are going extinct now than at any other point in human history. Go and watch this video to learn about the biggest bird to ever exist.